that gives us an idea about Reconstruction sort of as a whole. Like, what was it? Well, it's the policy that the federal government is putting in place in an attempt to bring the South back into the Union, right? To reconstruct the South basically in the North's image, right? They want to try to recreate the South in the North's image. But ultimately, proponents of Reconstruction really don't quite understand what they're facing in the South culturally, economically, politically, and it, for the most part, is an abject failure. So we gave a brief introduction to Reconstruction last time in Louisiana, so we're going to pick up then with presidential Reconstruction. The elevation of former planter James Madison Wells to the office of governor in March 1865, combined with the end of the war and Lincoln's assassination, dramatically altered the path of Reconstruction in Louisiana. Though he had been a Unionist and a fair-weather supporter of radical republicanism, Wells saw in President Andrew Johnson's proclamation of pardon and amnesty an opportunity to build a new political coalition out of returning Confederates and conservative Southern Unionists such as himself. Wells proved unable to control what he had created, however. The new statewide elections that the governor ordered held in November 1865 resulted in the election of an almost entirely Democratic legislature. Aided by President Johnson's leniency, the newly reconstituted state government set about passing laws such as the Black Codes and other laws designed to compel the return of freed blacks to agricultural labor. By the early months of 1866, radical Republicans and other advocates of universal suffrage faced grave danger from violence, which culminated in the New Orleans riot of 1866. Louisiana radicals met to introduce universal suffrage to the new state constitution. The police and volunteer firemen of New Orleans attacked and murdered more than 30 of those gathered. Along with a violent outbreak in Memphis earlier in the year, the riot in New Orleans proved influential in rallying Northern support behind radical political candidates, right? It encourages them. And as such, it played a crucial role in empowering the radical ascendancy in the fall 1866 congressional elections. So we really see that with presidential Reconstruction, although we have Republicans sort of in charge, the Democrats are still hanging on, and they still have a great deal of political sway. That stated, their violent tendencies does nothing to help them, right? So in thinking about this radical Republican ascendancy, in March 1867, over President Johnson's veto, the new U.S. Congress passed the first of 4 federal Reconstruction Acts and paved the way for the liquidation of the governments in Louisiana and 9 other southern states then being controlled by former Confederates. In addition to effectively disfranchising all those who had supported the rebellion, these acts placed Louisiana into a military district with Texas and established guidelines for the creation of a new state government that included ratification of the recently passed 14th Amendment. So quick pop quiz here. What is the 13th Amendment?
Wasn't that the 13th Amendment abolish slavery?
Yes, 13th Amendment, abolish slavery. What is the 14th Amendment?
Was that when you get to vote?
No.
It had to do with remaining states in the Union, and no one can be deprived without due process of law.
Deprived of what?
Life, liberty, or property, I believe.
Okay, there's something else. It's sort of, when you think about 13th, 14th, 15th, we're really looking at freed blacks who have now, they're now considered a part of the nation, right? So 13th abolishes slavery, 14th does what?
Gives them the right to vote.
Citizenship.
Citizenship. Very good. You remembered that from American history, didn't you? Good job. Now, 15th Amendment.
Was
Right to vote?
Okay. This is going to ensure that nobody can be denied access based on race or previous condition of servitude, right? But it also specifically says male. So in regards to women's suffrage, a lot of the women are very upset about this, particularly Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Lucretia Mott, and several others who are big proponents of women's rights. They are very upset because they have fought adamantly for abolition, and even during the Civil War, they put off fighting for certain aspects of women's rights in order to get freedom for those enslaved. So here we come, and the Civil War is over, and here come these amendments, and they have specifically said male, and they've excluded women. And it's at this point that Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and a couple others, they basically say they will no longer have male counsel, and they're really not seeking to do anything else. They also become very racist and very nativist at this point, and they're really just arguing for women's rights. That's going to come into play whenever we talk about the essay with Kate Gordon and her fight for states' rights suffrage. So, back to this. If I can find where I am on my notes. All right, the radical ascendancy created an enormous political vacuum in Louisiana and ultimately ushered in a prolonged era when men with competing visions of the future battled for control of the state. Louisianians set about crafting a new state constitution in the winter of 1867 and 1868. The document that emerged was quite revolutionary and provided for equal citizenship, the black franchise. What does that mean? Franchise?
Voting.
Voting. Okay, very good. Equal public accommodations. What would that include?
Like hotels, that kind of thing.
Very good. As well as public education. Balloting for new state office holders and the Constitution's ratification resulted in the election of Republicans Henry Clay Warmoth, an Army veteran and early advocate of universal suffrage, as governor, and Oscar J. Dunn, an African American, as lieutenant governor. So let's talk about Warmoth. Although he was only 26 years old when he took office, Warmoth had proven himself an astute political operator and understood the temperament of Louisianians in 1868. A witness to the riot of 1866, one of Warmoth's first actions was the creation of the Metropolitan Police. While the Metropolitans were initially conceived as a force capable of maintaining order in New Orleans, their policing powers extended to surrounding parishes and their duties to the preservation of Warmoth's government. This heavily armed body played an important role in the dramatic events that unfolded over the next 9 years. For the most part, disaffected whites had stayed out of the state electioneering in early 1868 and instead cast their gaze towards the upcoming presidential elections to take place in the fall. Believing that a national Democratic victory would snuff out radical Reconstruction, militarized political clubs mobilized across Louisiana in the summer of 1868. In rural parishes, such activity led to the formation of the Knights of the White Camilla, a group similar to the Ku Klux Klan. But in actuality, they are probably more closely linked to their urban counterparts in New Orleans, such as the Seymour Knights and Crescent City Democratic Club, political clubs organized along military lines for the purpose of intimidating Republican voters, most often with violence. The paramilitary violence during the national elections, both in Louisiana and elsewhere, inspired the newly elected Congress to pass the first of the Enforcement Acts. I didn't put this on the screen, but it is something that you probably read about in your textbook, so just pay attention to it. The Enforcement Acts, which were designed to empower the federal government to use the military to combat political insurgency in the South. Somebody translate that for me.
Basically make sure that the South followed what was passed.
Very good. And what can the federal government use to ensure that the South is doing what it's supposed to do?
Federal troops.
Force. Federal troops, exactly right. down at the bottom, the image that I have there, it's one that is really just striking. So on the right, you've got the KKK, who looks like such a happy little Casper ghost thing, right? On the left, we have a member of the White League, and you can't quite read it, but that's what the flap says coming out of his pocket. He's a member of the White League. And in the middle, you have a black family. It's a husband, a wife, and a baby, and they're hunched together. And what it says at the top is worse than slavery. So there's very much a great deal of tension, and there's also this feeling that the South and Louisiana, that nothing has changed. And in fact, it seems to have gotten worse. Political factionalism among Louisiana Republicans flowed from the fact that the party attracted men who were often at cross purposes, right? They're not aligned. On the one hand, the party's promotion of universal suffrage and civil rights legislation appealed to the overwhelming majority of freedmen as well as some idealistic whites. Yet on the other hand, some conservative white Southerners believed that in republicanism lay the best vehicle for restoring their class to a position of prosperity and political relevance, while others saw opportunity for profit in the power vacuum created by the radical ascendancy. Louisiana's Republicans fell into three basic groups. The first and most powerful was the Custom House Ring, which enjoyed the support of the National Republican Party led by President Grant. In an era before income taxes, when duty supplied the majority of the nation's income, few civil service appointments reflected greater political favor or more potential for graft than that of collector of customs. President Grant named his brother-in-law as collector at the port of New Orleans. He led the Custom House faction and controlled lucrative federal patronage in the state. The second group coalesced around Henry Clay Warmoth. The governor's control over state patronage and the Metropolitan Police allowed him to pose a formidable obstacle to Custom House hegemony. Yet both the Warmoth and Custom House factions recognized that neither was powerful enough to maintain control over the party without the support of the state's third bloc of Republicans, the newly enfranchised black voters. The need to respond to the aspirations of its black constituency often forced the Republican Party to pursue a more egalitarian course than what it might have done otherwise. This impulse was by turns the party's greatest strength and its largest liability. Those who battled against federal Reconstruction efforts, the so-called Redeemers, were also deeply divided. While they were overwhelmingly white and native to either Louisiana or other southern states, their number included many Northerners who had come to Louisiana after the Civil War. The social and economic stability promised by the restoration of white conservative rule appealed to these individuals because their plans for financial success hinged on the availability of a plentiful and obedient labor force. When you live in an agrarian society, you need workers, right? Lots and lots of workers. Yet disagreements over the acceptability of various political and social changes divided Redeemers. At the most reactionary end of the spectrum stood Louisiana's Bourbon Democrats, who rejected most forms of black civil rights and political agency. By the start of 1869, however, many white Southerners had come to reject the Bourbon strategy as impractical and had correctly identified such belligerence as the motive behind the passage of the Federal Reconstruction Acts. These individuals, who considered themselves conservative Democrats or reformers, disassociated with the National Democratic Party name and advocated a limited acceptance of Reconstruction measures, including a recognition of the permanence of black political participation. Yet, like most white Americans of the era, the conservatives rejected black social equality. The reformers' stronghold was in New Orleans, whereas the Bourbon Democrats dominated Louisiana's countryside, though neither could make an exclusive claim on either region. Warmoth believed that by courting the conservative Democrats into a centrist Republican Party, he might be able to build an enduring political legacy. In this, he was remarkably successful. And by 1870, demoralization in Democratic ranks had reached an all-time high. In the end, Warmoth was toppled not by reactionary Southerners, but by jealous Republicans in the Custom House ring. Warmoth's friendliness to former Confederates and his stinting progress on civil rights enabled the Custom House faction to woo Warmoth's African-American Lieutenant Governor, Oscar J. Dunn, into their fold. Because of his deserved reputation for integrity, Dunn was among the most popular political figures among black Louisianians during Reconstruction, and he had great influence over the sizable black vote. By the summer of 1871, the Custom House faction had also co-opted the support of other Republican legislators who had once belonged to the Warmoth camp. The Custom House faction plotted to impeach Warmoth and place Dunn, who he believed would act as a reliable puppet in the governor's office. They also enlisted the help of disgruntled Bourbon Democrats who hated Warmoth because of his success in dividing white Southerners politically, but were unsuccessful in their attempts. Although Warmoth survived this attack by the Custom House group, he would never again retain full control over Louisiana's Republican Party. The governor soon split with the new lieutenant governor, African-American Pinckney Benton Stewart Pinchback, or PBS Pinchback, over the contentious issue of equal public accommodations, and made a more significant break with the Custom House faction and President Grant in 1872 by heading the splinter liberal Republican movement in the state. Ultimately, Warmoth came to endorse a fusionism campaign made up of Bourbon Democrats, conservative reformers, and liberal Republicans. No longer in control of the Metropolitan Police, the lame duck Warmoth was finally removed from office, making Pinchback the only man of color to serve as governor of a state during Reconstruction. But his term only lasted 35 days. How successful is that? Not quite sure. But it was something. Fraud and controversy marked the 1872 gubernatorial election at all levels. Both sides engaged in measures designed to eliminate the count of their competitor while inflating their own tally. Shock and surprise, right? Voting fraud and corruption in Louisiana. In the end, however, balloting would be less relevant to the outcome than control over the returns. As governor, Warmoth had signed legislation that gave the chief executive enormous control over counting the votes, but his loss of control over the party led to the emergence of rival returning boards. Ultimately, a Republican-controlled judiciary decided which board's total would be counted, leading to the elevation of William Kellogg. While it is possible that Kellogg had indeed received more votes, his means of ascent undermined his legitimacy in Louisiana and eroded support for national Reconstruction policy in the North. As a result, rival legislatures began cropping up, which ultimately erupted in violence. In Grant Parish, an ugly scene unfolded when a struggle between rival claimants to the office of parish judge blew up into the Colfax Massacre, the bloodiest outbreak of racial violence during Reconstruction. When a black militia attempted to sustain Kellogg's appointee and maintain control over the Grant Parish courthouse in the town of Colfax, white mobs descended upon them and killed 100 or more black men. The damage to Republican aspirations did not stop there, however. Prosecuting the killers under the Federal Enforcement Acts led to a broader legal disaster. In United States versus Cruikshank, 1875, the U.S. Supreme Court concluded that the federal government had overstepped its authority with the Enforcement Acts, effectively undermining their meaning. With the demise of these laws went all hope that rural Republicans in the South might have of using the Army to protect or preserve their safety. Once again, events in Louisiana had proven essential to national outcomes. The summer of 1873 also witnessed the most unusual, if short-lived, efforts in biracial political cooperation during Reconstruction. The unification movement began in New Orleans as a cooperative effort between elite Afro-Creoles who were being left out of Kellogg's Republican faction and white moderate businessmen who yearned for a peaceful end to Kellogg's regime. Their pronouncements were perhaps the most advanced thinking on race to appear anywhere during Reconstruction, and resembled closely what Congress would enact almost a century later in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. A lack of support in New Orleans and virtually no support in rural Louisiana among whites, combined with Republican sabotage, effectively doomed the unification movement before it could gain any meaningful following. With federal Reconstruction policy waning in popularity around the nation, a weakening national economy, and the widespread belief in Kellogg's illegitimacy, conservative and Bourbon Democrats concluded by 1874 that a violent overthrow of republicanism in Louisiana might be tolerated. Devoted to this end, the first White League formed in Opelousas in April of that year. It was always something of an ad hoc organization, and neighboring parishes soon established their own chapters, modeled loosely on the Opelousas charter. The most tangible effect of the White League was to suppress the factionalism that had dogged conservative and Bourbon efforts at overthrowing republicanism. And as a consequence, the League functioned as something of a coalition between moderates and hardliners. White supremacy, particularly in social relationships, tied these groups together, as did the assumption that black politics were generally corrupt politics. The ultimate goal of the White League was to overthrow Kellogg's rule. Resistance to the White League in northern and central Louisiana was ineffectual at best, but in the Republican stronghold of New Orleans, the Metropolitan Police stood as a significant obstacle to complete revolution. Under the leadership of a former Confederate colonel named Frederick Nash Ogden, that's a great name, isn't it? Nash. And in concert with conservative Democratic political leadership, the White League began in the spring and summer of 1874 to train a militia that was capable of overthrowing the government. The inevitable collision occurred on September 14, 1874, in an event that participants would soon call the Battle of Liberty Place. Following a mass rally around the Henry Clay statue on Canal Street, the White League assembled in a line of battle in what is today the central business district of New Orleans and headed toward Canal Street and a waiting contingent of Metropolitan Police. The brief battle that ensued left more than 30 men dead and resulted in a complete rout of the police. The White League pronounced 2 men its chief executives, and for 3 days the city remained in their hands. Only when federal troops threatened to use force to restore Kellogg did the White League relinquish control. Yet no White Leaguers were prosecuted for their actions, and the organization remained a powerful threat to Republican survival. More important, they had largely destroyed the Metropolitans as a fighting force. Only federal troops now kept Kellogg in power, and his opponents knew it. Reflective of the growing unpopularity of federal Reconstruction policy in the nation was the Democratic Party's sweeping to power in the U.S. House of Representatives in the fall 1874 elections, where it moved to further reduce the Army's occupation of the South. By the time the 1876 gubernatorial elections arrived, Louisiana was one of only 3 southern states where the Reconstruction-era Republican governments remained. Once again, widespread ballot fraud prevented an accurate tally of votes. In the presidential contest that year, Republican candidate Rutherford B. Hayes needed the electoral votes from the 3, quote-unquote, unredeemed southern states in order to win. After Hayes met with delegates who represented the Democratic and conservative forces in Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina in Washington, D.C., the basic outlines of the Compromise of 1877 took shape. It guaranteed that the Louisiana's electors would support Hayes' presidential ambitions in return for a promise that the federal government, among other things, would withdraw troops from the state. The bargain, which was rather controversial at the time, effectively brought an end to federal Reconstruction efforts in the South. Once again, the actions of Louisianians had a direct impact upon the outcome of key national questions. Abandoned by many of their white Republican allies, black Louisianians would continue to fight bravely for their political and social rights in the Redeemer era. But it would be a steady retreat culminating in the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling in Plessy versus Ferguson of 1896, as well as Louisiana's disfranchisement constitution of 1898. Significant victories included PBS Pinchback's securing the charter for what would become Southern University in 1879. Meanwhile, the White League coalition split into warring factions almost immediately following the Compromise of 1877, creating a period of political turmoil that would pit conservative reformers against the Bourbons for the rest of the century. The political corruption continued unabated. Not until the turn of the century, when Jim Crow became the law of the land and most black Louisianians had been removed from the voting rolls, could the champions of white supremacy claim victory. As important as politics were to the story of Reconstruction in Louisiana, it was also a period of crucial economic, legal, social, and cultural change. Despite many efforts at building railroads, fixing levees, and otherwise reestablishing the commerce and economic health of the state, the acrimony that characterized politics tended to blunt any meaningful progress. They're having issues, right? While valuable programs such as public education gained an important foothold during the era, the inability to establish a competitive east-west rail line, combined with burgeoning competition from Midwestern states, meant that Louisiana lost some of its importance in the national and regional economy, a trend that would continue for many decades. Corruption certainly played a role, but the nearly constant political turmoil in Louisiana also scared away investment. From an economic standpoint, the Civil War and Reconstruction proved a setback from which the state technically has yet fully to recover. With the destruction of slavery in Louisiana came the transition to free labor and a reappraisal of the relationship between black and white Louisianians. In the early years of Reconstruction, the Freedmen's Bureau assisted this process to varying degrees. In the state's cotton-growing parishes, this ultimately meant a changeover to sharecropping and improved autonomy for freedmen. Although working on shares was difficult, the number of black farmers who were able to save enough money to purchase land grew significantly during Reconstruction. In Louisiana's sugar-growing regions, planters made a less smooth transition to a wage economy, as sugar cultivation did not lend itself to small-scale production. Recognizing their bargaining power, cane workers made several attempts to organize for better wages. Ultimately, the larger sugar planters would crush cane workers' unrest in the Thibodeau Massacre of 1887. Like black politics, black labor made many important gains during Reconstruction, only to see them slowly evaporate by the turn of the century. Another issue facing farmers, black and white, is the crop lien system. The crop lien system is basically a system of credit. A farmer needs certain tools, right? And not just tools that you use by hand, but seeds to grow your crops, different things like that. Or if you are growing cotton or sugarcane and you need the tools to manufacture or get those items ready for manufacturing, you need to be able to process your crop. So the crop lien system established a system of credit. You had a furnishing merchant who kept a book, they kept a ledger. You as a farmer would go to that person, to the merchant, and you would say, I need X number of tools, X amount of seed, so on and so forth. The merchant would write that down, give you the things, and you were expected to pay basically whatever all that stuff was worth, plus like 25 to 30% interest when the crop came in. Will farmers ever get out of debt?
No.
No, not under the crop lien system. And this is going to give rise to the populist movement, which will come later, and ultimately will result in the progressive movement where Huey P. Long comes in. Events in Louisiana during Reconstruction also contributed significantly to the legal foundations of the nation, particularly in regard to civil rights. Without question, the most pivotal action to originate in Louisiana during Reconstruction came to be known collectively as the slaughterhouse cases. Intended to settle the question of the city's authority to regulate slaughterhouses for the public well-being, the verdict ended up drastically limiting the reach of the 14th Amendment to protect citizens against the actions of individual states. Cultural changes also abounded after the Civil War. For instance, Mardi Gras underwent a profound transformation during Reconstruction as a direct result of the troubled politics of the era. Left out of politics, white elites in New Orleans retreated to the private sphere, where they founded what are today the old line crews of Rex, Proteus, and Momus. Their elaborate parades served both as public entertainment and a vehicle for political and social commentary. Indeed, Reconstruction was not only largely responsible for cementing the city's devotion to Carnival. By 1872, it had become a major tourist attraction, drawing as many as 30,000 visitors from all over the nation each year. So, that concludes our discussion on Reconstruction.